for the companies to do so. We impose corporate liability all the time, things like giving severance package, even though the company wasn't responsible for either the reason why you got fired or things like that, because we realize that the company are individuals that are more capable of cushioning the lives of individuals, and fundamentally we prioritize the well-being of individual over this vague sense of morality or whether or not that is fair, over whether or not you have jobs or whether or not you are taken care of. That's a more important principle compared to a vague sense of merit and fairness. Secondly, let's move on to the second issue on whether or not their alternative, which is the state is able to pay this individual, is even a viable or feasible alternative. My second speaker already told you why it's not feasible to begin with. Why countries who cannot predict or cannot control advancement of technology means that they probably don't have a huge amount of money saved for when an innovation could possibly disrupt an industry. It's not like they have a bank for when a new innovation is going to come up and how many jobs do I have to compensate for. Countries like America and Malaysia also are unable to even sustain things like sufficient welfare, any basic unemployment benefits. That's why it's not feasible for a majority of countries like Malaysia, India, and the list goes on to reasonably compensate every individual who has lost their job due to the disruption of an industry. So that means that there are two conclusions we can draw from that. Firstly, the government cannot pay compensation. If they impose that and say that the government should, this is a horrible idea because of the amount of money that the government will lose. Means that the government have to take away money from things like pumping into things like infrastructure, other welfare, as well as other social causes and the economy. Things like the government will be possibly bankrupt. Thirdly, we also say that the government then cannot control their losses due to their inability to control innovation. But if you force them into that, they have to control their losses. They have to control innovation. They have to clamp down on innovation because it's the only way they can be a functioning and feasible government. But they say, oh no, the government will have to keep up with other countries anyway. We don't see that actually happening. A lot of countries like China and India are not very favorable of environmental policies because it's not financially favorable for them. It's much easier to sell to a voter that I'm going to keep you alive and give you enough money for you to sustain yourself than possibly encourage things like environmental awareness. Not every single middle-class individual are very keen on the idea of environmental awareness if it's going to keep them out of a job or going to ensure that they don't get things like welfare or money to begin with. A normal common incentive of individual is to ensure that they are first able to survive, then only move on to things like other principal arguments like environmental things. We think that those things are usually subsidiary in the mind of the voters, therefore not enough pressure to actually pressure for enough innovation on their side. But let's move on to the next question on whether or not these companies are actually capable of doing this payout. We told you these are not companies that disrupt an industries, are not companies that just came out that could possibly disrupt an industry, but companies who have already disrupted an industry. That means that the amount of money they have to pay, and very clearly said by Jay's speech, is the amount of losses suffered from the other industry after they have disrupted that industry. That means that the amount of profit they gain and the amount of loss that the other company gain. Therefore, that company directly profit from the loss that the other companies suffer. Companies like Amazon and companies that produce e-books directly profit from all the losses of money that book companies like Borders suffer. So therefore, to that extent, we can really quantify how much money they actually owe, and all those other subsidiary reasons are reasons we're going to exclude if it's not their fault. We think that's perfectly reasonable to calculate. Furthermore, we told you also that innovation was so much more likely on our side. We already told you from the first and second speaker that government will tend to clamp down on innovation if they can't control it. But secondly, that means that because realizing what the government incentives are, the government's main incentive to ensure that most amount of people are employed at most of the time, right? That means only richer nations with high-skilled laborers will be the only nation that will continuously innovate under their policy. This is because richer nations have higher skilled laborers that don't have to be continuously employed by these previous industries. So that's why innovation can only happen in richer countries under their policy, but will never reach middle-class countries and will continuously exclude them and exile them from any form of innovation. But what they said was that now companies will sit on patents and things like that. Well, firstly, we don't think that that is something that will naturally happen. If companies have spent millions of research fund into creating a new innovation, we don't think the most strategic thing for them to do is continuously sit on that patent, especially if they predict that it can disrupt an entire industry. They only have to pay so long as they compensate that industry for the losses, and after that can continuously profit from displacing that industry and actually having a huge market. So that industry, this new innovation, is a sustainable innovation that can continue to profit, but in the meantime, they just have to compensate people at the initial stages for the losses that they create. Furthermore, let's talk about this last issue about how do we create a change in behavior of society. Because they told us that the change in behavior of society is something natural without even analyzing to us how that thought process began. Because we cannot really assume that every individual is very receptive to innovation. A lot of people in third world countries are afraid of the word innovation because it screams things like Western, it screams things like takeover, it screams things like loss of jobs. The only way you can create a change in the minds of this individual is to remove that process of demonization of the word innovation. So that means that you remove the sting from the rhetoric that environmental politicians can have when they say things like innovation that will be now accepted more. They'll now be accepted with a better light because individuals realize that even if innovation happens, the government as well as the companies care about us as well as willing to take on the cost that was bared because of that innovation. We think that will make people a lot more receptive to innovation. That will make innovation a lot more likely the more people support it and the more people are willing to buy it. Because realize that just because things are getting cheaper doesn't mean that everybody feels that that's a good thing. If they realize that the immediate cost they can see is that they lose their jobs, they don't immediately react to things being cheaper. If they realize that their jobs are fundamentally lost in that process, the economy is going down and their government has to pay a lot of money, we're extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, Jasmine, for the third speech, and now I call upon Ellie to join the pronounce here today to stage and begin the third language speech.
Mr. Speaker, governments benefit from innovation. They benefit in the increased tax receipts that they receive from companies who go on to be multi-billion-dollar companies like Amazon. Governments benefit when those companies go on to hire huge workforces in replacement of the workforces that they single-handedly had to subsidize through protectionism, like what happened when the automobile industry failed and was replaced by other, more successful financial services. Governments aren't afraid of innovation in the way that the opposition wanted to say. The only people who are afraid of innovation, who are public in lobbying against them, are those who might lose their jobs. But that doesn't mean that governments should be held ransom to those individuals. It means that they should conceive of that unemployment in the same way as it does any other kind of unemployment, whether it was caused by an economic downturn, whether it was caused by the fact that industries naturally fail, whether it was caused by the fact that consumer tastes and preferences change over time. There is no reason why the failure of a certain industry as a result of disruptive innovation was any different to the unemployment caused by a myriad of other factors. The government was equally responsible for both and should conceive of their obligation as such. Two questions in this debate. Firstly, should disruptive companies or states bear the principled obligation of compensating redundancies? And secondly, how do we best incentivize socially productive innovation? To the first question. The First Affirmative started this debate by talking about the immense power that governments have to affect the ability of companies to sink or swim in the legislative processes that they engage in. We agreed, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we thought that governments should bear the burden of compensating for unemployment. We thought that this was a fairly uncontroversial statement to suggest. That's why, for instance, they never told us why Tesla was at fault for disruptively innovating at the expense of Chrysler's employees, but not, for instance, Facebook being responsible for the unemployment caused by MySpace, just because Facebook happened to be a better, more profitable, well-liked company. That was the actual comparison. They then told us that this was analogous to the severance packages that companies had to pay out when their own employees were made redundant. But that missed Ed's analysis about the fact that when you are the employer of an employee, you did have a certain level of control over whether that employee would become redundant. You had the ability to do things like, for instance, decide how you responded to economic changes, to determine how you would allocate capital, to decide whether or not you would outroll a new product line. All those things made you, as an actor, partially responsible, if not completely responsible, for the redundancy of that employee. That becomes completely different when you take it a step removed. Because, for instance, whilst Tesla could have predicted that it would come at the expense of industries such as Chrysler, it had no control over the success with which Chrysler reacted to the threat of innovation to that company and the ability it had to succeed in that threat. It also had no control over whether Tesla was employing too many workers, such that its liability for that far outweighed what it was fair to do. It also had no control over how much money Tesla was paying its employees, such that it shouldn't be liable for the hypothetical costs in that regard. All those things make it an absurd responsibility to place on disruptive companies just because they happen to be better than other companies. But why do they tell us that the government literally couldn't be the ones to compensate? This was their strongest material. First line of attack was that it was unfeasible to raise taxes because it was politically unpopular. The problem is, firstly, that that is factually untrue. There is huge political impetus when you're looking at instances like the failure of the automobile industry in South Australia. There was a huge payout package from the government to foster employment in that area. When you look at the federal funding allocated to places like Detroit, if they want to use their own example, is huge. Why is that the case, Mr. Speaker? Because the narrative that surrounds that under the current system is that the government was partially responsible for allowing places like Detroit to fail. That the government didn't foresee the very obvious demise of the automobile industry in America for 40 years and didn't employ retraining programs to ensure that it didn't get to the point where these people in Detroit literally couldn't be employed by anyone else. The fact that the government didn't implement protective measures to stop the housing bubble crashing in Detroit, causing that bubble to flee. How does that change under your side? Because now that government says, well, it's not our fault, it's Tesla's fault. So you can just go knock on Tesla's door and have your say. But what does that do? It shifts the onus onto these now impoverished, unemployed workers to what? Find their local lawyer and stage a multi-billion-dollar suit against a giantly successful firm that will crush them to a pulp. This isn't Eric Brockovich style. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a total inability for people to access these resources and actually achieve outcomes. But the second thing that they told us was that disruptive firms can control how fast they disrupt an industry and put people out of their jobs. But that was also confusing, Mr. Speaker, because to the extent that you as a disruptive innovator want to achieve market share, what is the difference under your model of perpetual liability from innovating now versus innovating in 3 years if you're always going to displace the same number of workers over that time? It encourages you to employ really nasty sorts of tactics, like, for instance, strangling those workers so that they retire or quit their jobs before they're likely to stay in those jobs so that you no longer can prove that you made them redundant, you just say that they quit. But secondly, even if it were true that disruptive firms can predict it, they aren't the only cause of the demise of these firms. We look at things like the automobile industry that was being propped up by America. Even if electric cars had never been invented, it was always going to fail when you looked at cheaper competitors in Asia, like Mitsubishi or those other firms. So why does it have to be the burden of Tesla to pay? But also, why is there a first mover disadvantage in this instance? So for instance, Uber is the disruptive innovator that would make you responsible for the taxi industry's payouts, despite the fact that Lyft came around as a copycat 2 years later and now wouldn't face the same costs to do with that. That's a weird economic incentive that you put in your model. But also, we tell you that governments are better at predicting and addressing these things. To give their example of Detroit, what happens under yours once, even if they get their cash payout? They get that cash in hand and flee Detroit, move elsewhere with their money. The government injects money into Detroit. So even if you weren't an automobile worker, but you were relying on the payouts of those automobile workers as a convenience store owner or as a consumer salesman, you're able to be compensated in a way they can't give you. How do we best incentivize socially productive behavior? The primary contention of the opposition was that places don't like disruptive innovators because they make people unemployed. They gave us the example in third speaker of countries like China. First response is, the actual reason why there is often huge backlash against innovation often has very little to do with just unemployment. We think that the third speaker herself gave an example in China where they're perceived as anti or pro-Western or imperialist would be a reason that didn't go away under their side of the house. But also things like the fact that the entire Chinese economy is built on coal and manufacturing would probably be a pretty good reason why China is resistant to the emergence of renewables. It's not going to be like, well, now we'll compensate for your unemployment but not create an industry that you can now rely on. Unfathomable logic from the opposition. Mr. Speaker, their argumentation was illogical as it was unfair. It took a first mover and made them responsible for something out of their control, out of their power, and something that was the state's responsibility. Proud to oppose.
Now call upon the next passenger.
Mr. Speaker, sometimes the invisible hand of the market allocates the benefits of progress disproportionately. What we told you in that circumstance is that we prefer the very real hand of the collective that owes an obligation to their fellow citizens who invest in their own skills, instead of a policy that would see that invisible hand close on all of the benefits that disruptive innovation provides. The first question I want to ask in this speech is innovation important? How do we secure it? Because this team agreed that innovation was broadly beneficial, but they saw the world and the status quo as one in which it was being held back by governments with political incentives to shut it down. What we did is we clarified what those benefits were and why they were so important in outweighing the obligations that corporations might otherwise have to workers affected by their policies. That benefit came in the form of cheaper clothes, it came in the form of cheaper and more abundant food, it came in the form of consumer goods that made the lives of vulnerable workers elsewhere in the economy more enjoyable and better. So to the extent that governments, corporations owed anything to displaced workers, we thought they were already providing it. They were also providing it in the form of better and different jobs that came as a result of the very direct disruptive innovation that they had. That meant that Amazon workers could now process orders in air-conditioned offices rather than stand in big retail Demix books chains instead. But the second thing that we told you is that this team utterly jeopardized those benefits, because morality ultimately didn't matter in this debate if they couldn't prove that this was a policy in a world in which that innovation would happen. And they never responded at all to our material about how this disruptive innovation often comes from small companies that have good ideas and highly skilled teams. That the workforces that they might displace would be huge, and that investors, who are normally risk averse anyway, would not have the same confidence as the affirmative team did in the ability of governments and courts to allocate the costs of that fairly. And that meant that they would not give those funds away, and we would not see the benefits of that innovation. But their comparative said, well, our world's impossible because governments will clamp down and won't be able to fund it. The first response we had was implicit in all of our cases. The examples that we gave you of positive disruption where governments did not clamp down but allowed it to occur. What did governments do in those circumstances? Well, they bailed out the South Australian car industry. They supported the workers of Detroit in reskilling and retraining. We thought that that was where their political incentives lied. Because they got higher tax receipts from that innovation, because society had higher living standards, because they needed to be internationally competitive, and because the moral compass of society that said that things like the environment were important were ultimately things that governments had to be subject to. At the end of the day, states were the most responsible actor. They were also the most capable and most politically aligned actor in being able to provide the types of support this team wanted. But the second question is, where should the moral obligation for protecting redundant workers fall? We think we won the practical arguments in this debate, but we think if we win this principle, it doesn't really matter. Because we told you that it's the collective that benefits from the types of disruptive change that we had, either through government subsidies or through consumers buying the product and the revealed preferences that sort of gave across. But the collective incentives were also better, because the political costs of disrupting a particular locality were very high when it came to allocating seats within Parliament. That meant governments would also always do this. We also told you that the governments were best at giving compensation, because they were unlikely to give cash that would see people use that cash to flee or move elsewhere, but to retrain workers in industries that they knew would be competitive into the future. But even if it wasn't the state, we told you that companies had no moral obligation, because no employee has the right to a job indefinitely. Engineers that trained in that subject might lose their job because of no fault of their own. Didn't mean that somebody had to compensate them. But industry failure is often complex, and there's concurrent factors involved that are less easy to disentangle than measure, where a monopoly exists, and something that these guys never responded to. But we also told you that disruptive companies already had to bear the cost of fighting to see other workers displaced through things like the lobbying power of unions and the lobbying power of industries that did not want to change and did not want to see those benefits shared with the rest of society. Mr. Speaker, we lived in a better world of more progress, but we also lived in a more moral world where the responsibilities of the collective were properly allocated. We oppose.
Our negative class speaker for his speech, and I'll call upon the affirmative class speaker.
We had a very strange negative in this debate. We had a characterization in negative that we're talking about very small companies who are new, poor, in debt, not successful, but apparently so ultimately disruptive in society, ladies and gentlemen. We had a negative that had mechanistic issues right down to the reply speech, in which they were concerned about us calculating things like monopoly, when we already could see things like standards of reason, ladies and gentlemen, being able to calculate whether you were able to react to certain innovations, whether you were inefficient in industry, ladies and gentlemen, or whether it was your own fault in those circumstances. And we think that we also had a negative in this debate that cried about how innovation was an unlimited liability towards a company, ladies and gentlemen. They would react adversely, but apparently the people that had their jobs reliant upon those particular industries that were being displaced would not react adversely to kind of unlimited liability that you're placing upon society, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the negative in this debate have been wholly uncomparative. They told us that innovation, and they agreed that innovation was a moral imperative. But the argument that they tell us is that we can shift that responsibility towards society in general. We say that they say in the worst case scenario, we'll bail them out. When in my speech, I gave you an entire analysis about how those kind of stopgap measures were wholly catastrophic, ladies and gentlemen, when you have bailouts and economic depressions in certain areas, when you have irresponsible innovations, ladies and gentlemen, that jeopardize entire national economies by jeopardizing the kind of confidence that you had in particular economies. We received absolutely zero response from the negative in regards to how that minute, non-homogeneous economy which I talked about will be severely disrupted and will be catastrophic in terms of you just relying on a bailout, which, guys, is pretty unpopular in society, ladies and gentlemen. They finally had their last leg on standing on the state having to care about society and having to bear the brunt of society. We told you that economic depression and things like holding entire communities putting them into unemployment was a moral wrong in society that needed to be corrected. We told you that it was impractical that a society or an economy, ladies and gentlemen, or a government, ladies and gentlemen, that was unable to see an increasingly advanced economy or increasingly advanced technological landscape, ladies and gentlemen, would be able to foresee these technological changes. We're not talking about the spinning chimney, ladies and gentlemen, or cotton anymore. We're talking about severely advanced technology like solar energy and moving towards more and more advanced technology in the future? Do you think that it's practical to retrain somebody that's right now just making cars or making petroleum cars in a Ford factory and retrain them immediately, ladies and gentlemen, lest you risk unemployment or cyclical unemployment under that side of the house? This was a harm that was never engaged with under that side of the house. They said that we needed to have immediate profits, or we need these small companies to be able to thrive. We engaged even in the worst case scenario under that side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. We told you that even in those circumstances, that society doesn't always benefit from that innovation. We told you that sometimes innovation isn't always something that governments celebrate, or isn't something that society always accept with open arms, contrary to what the whip in late response wanted to say, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes there's thorough opposition to a technological advancement because of the kind of incentive structures that we talked about. They didn't want to respond. Finally, they told us that okay, that sometimes people may respond, and even in those circumstances, we told you, only the richest and most educated societies will finally be able to accommodate the changes that you're talking about, leaving the poor, the unskilled, and the uneducated, ladies and gentlemen, high and dry, as Ed would like to tell you. Political motives are exorbitant in a world where the poor and uneducated drive political motives and tell you that I'm unwilling to accept this change, ladies and gentlemen. This debate was always about sustainable, responsible economic development where we can place responsibility where it could actually be manifested, not an idealistic world where we push everything to the state. I'm exceptionally proud to propose.